Peter, thank you for joining me today. This is great. I just got your book in the mail. I really appreciate it. This is super exciting because we communicated last week around PitchHub, and I was helping you get everything installed. You were and Musha, your wife, were talking to a book slash movie club, and I'd maybe explain the folks that you used the teleprompter for as you were talking about your book, but that organization is pretty fantastic also. So maybe if you introduce yourself, talk about this, talk about who you were talking to on Sunday.
Sure. Well, Peter Eisner is me. I'm a journalist and writer. I used to be at the Washington Post, among other places, and I left the Post some years back, not that many years back, to start writing books. And one of the first projects I got into was a trilogy of books about World War II. The first one is the one we're going to talk about, which is called The Freedom Line. And it is about a group of young people in Europe who rescued Allied airmen in occupied territory and shepherded them in a series of safe houses and on a various ways of conveyance in a very dangerous atmosphere through occupied Europe, from Belgium, Holland, through France to Spain, and then back to England to fight another day. So that was the first book I did on World War II. Then I did another one on Pope Pius XI, not Pope Pius XII, which a lot of people think about. This was the Pope before World War II, who opposed Hitler and Mussolini and was fighting Hitler's anti-Semitism. That book is called The Pope's Last Crusade. And then finally, I did a third book. I'm doing this in chronological order, by the way, which is called MacArthur's Spies, which is about a young woman from Washington State from Oregon, who found herself in the Philippines at the start of World War II. She was a nightclub singer, torch singer. She was stuck there because the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor the same time as they attacked the Philippines. And she fled for the hills, met a bunch of American military guys who refused to surrender to the Japanese. She signed on with them. They sent her back down to Manila, where she became a double agent, opened a nightclub catering to Japanese officers, and gathered information to send back to her contacts in the hills, who in turn were contacting General MacArthur. And that it tells that whole story. It's pretty amazing story. So all of these stories are linked for me about moral choices that people make. And the books are nonfiction, but the realm is narrative nonfiction, which means it feels like a novel, and they all feel like a novel, but they're accurate down to the phases of the moon. So that's where we are. So Freedom Line was the first of these. It tells the story of a young American pilot named Bob Grimes, 20 years old, flying a B-17 over Belgium on his fifth mission one fine day in October 1943, and he's shot down. And a group of people, many of them young women, barely out of their teens, were able to track him, rescue him. He was wounded. They nursed him back to health. Bob Grimes was transported by this group called the Comet Line, one of the largest escape lines during World War II. And they transported him down to the Spanish-French border on December 23rd, 1943, at which time he and a bunch of other pilots and some spies are led across the border through the Pyrenees and down to a raging river into Spanish territory, and tells that whole story. With the backbone of Bob Grimes, we learn about this wonderful group of young people led by women who saved 700 airmen or more at great peril, and with hundreds of them being arrested, some of them killed. It's a very exciting story and little known.
Is Dee Dee the leader? So Day Day, you mentioned her, and I was watching that video. And was she the kind of the leader of the group?
De Young is her name. She was a Belgian nurse who, when she saw the Nazis march into Belgium in 1940, was more than she could bear, and she figured out a way to set up this escape line called the Comet Line, as I said, and established a network of like-minded people, young people who were not willing to accept fascism. Some of them were runners, some of them were forgers, some of them simply had safe houses where they could hide people, understanding that all of these people, if caught by the Nazis, would be just immediately killed. And they did it anyway. And Day was the founder. She signed up with the British consulate in Bilbao, Spain, which agreed to work with her and help her make this happen, provide some funding and provide logistics, which made it successful. She was remarkable. One facet of the story at the outset is that after 8 months of her operations being successful, the book starts out with her being captured by the Nazis in January 1943. The network was so diverse and so strong that they were able to survive, and not only survive, they tried to rescue her unsuccessfully, and she remained in concentration camps until the end of the war.
Incredible. And so she did get decorated by King George, correct?
Yes, she was liberated from a concentration camp, but where other people were obviously being murdered, and she managed to survive that. She was beaten and tortured terribly. In 1946, she was recognized for her exploits. The pilots knew her well by reputation. Think about how important this was. American and British pilots were being shot down every day over occupied territory. And what were they to think as they were flying their missions? What would happen if they were shot down? Well, they might likely be captured by the Germans and end up in a prisoner of war camp at best. But once Day and her friends put together their operations, they knew that they had a good chance of being contacted, hidden, and saved. So the morale factor and the need to get pilots back into action was huge. So this was a real significant part of winning the war against Hitler. And she was recognized for that in 1946. She got the so-called George Award, which is named for King George, I guess maybe one of the prior King Georges, but this was King George VI, the father of Queen Elizabeth.
Amazing. And so the book on how you started with the Freedom Line is, as I remember, or as I read, you and Musha stumbled upon a hotel, or she showed you a hotel that had a lot of history, and then you started diving into it, and then you started to talk to people and even go on some of the treks and through different countries. Is that correct? I mean, or
that's right. You got it right. You got it right, Andrew. So Musha is Argentinian, but her background is entirely Basque, both on her mother and father's side. And we started to go to the Basque Country every summer in the 1990s, late 1990s. And one summer, I guess it was around 2000, one of her cousins was driving us back from the French side to the Spanish side of the border, which now once in the book, dangerous and treacherous, is now like crossing from my hometown of Bergenfield, New Jersey to Hackensack, New Jersey, or something like that. The bridge is about the same size, just a little tiny bridge. Anyway, the cousin, Raphael, took us to an old hotel in the hills overlooking the border. And we were immediately amazed that this place was obviously pre-war. And I said to Raphael, this has got to have been some kind of amazing place during World War II. Spain was nominally neutral, so anybody could show up in Spain and evade capture, either from either side. So he said, yes, the Nazis were here, the Americans were here, the French were here. It was spy central. And it felt to me like Casablanca, you could feel it. So from there, Musha's family helped me research some more, and we met a local historian who said, oh yeah, I've written about this. This is where, after all, the pilots came across. And I said, pilots? And he said, yeah, the American and Allied pilots that the Basques saved in the Pyrenees. I said, no, nothing about it. And he said, oh yeah, and he had a list of every rescue that these people had made from 1941 to 1944. And I looked over the list and I found an interesting story of this fellow, Bob Grimes, who survived Christmas Eve 1943. Some of the people getting across the river that day did not survive. And I brought his name back to Washington when I got home, and I started looking around on the internet, and I found, oh, this guy might still be around. And I contacted a veterans group, and they said, yeah, good old Bob, he lives in Virginia. And it turned out he lived like a half an hour away from me, and we started communicating and talking, and that was really how the book started. So Musha and I, throughout this, worked together. She and I went back together to Europe. We interviewed some of the aging survivors that were still there, some fascinating women that survived it. And when it was over, Musha and I participated in a reconstruction of what was once that treacherous crossing of the French-Spanish border. And we met people that had actually been children who still remembered the pilots coming across and their parents hiding them in their homes. Again, imagine what would have happened if they'd been caught on either side of the border, because the Spanish were supposedly neutral, but Francisco Franco was the dictator. Yeah. He had won the Spanish Civil War, and he basically aligned with Hitler and the Nazis, and remained nominally neutral because he needed U.S. aid to economic aid and food to survive during the war. And the Americans, particularly Franklin Roosevelt, worked hard to keep Spain out of the war. And that was a very successful thing. And also it enabled the British consulate to gather up the pilots, sometimes having to ransom them from prison and bribe the prison guards in Spain and smuggle them, usually in the trunk of a diplomatic car, from northern Spain down to Gibraltar. So it was treacherous all the way along. Bush and I got a sense of that when we crossed the border with these other, with the children of some of the original members of the escape line, and in some cases the actual people who were with us well into their 80s, but were there to tell the story. The foundation that asked us to speak is called the Aristides Sosa Mendes Foundation. And that foundation is dedicated, obviously, to Aristides Sosa Mendes, who was a Portuguese diplomat in Europe during World War II And he, on his own, without official support, wrote visas for refugees that were stuck in occupied France, many of them Jews that could otherwise be murdered, and helped them get to that same border between France and Spain and rescue them. So there was a great affinity between Musha and me and our book with their stories. It was a delight to be able to speak with them and to tell the story.
Give people a sense of who is Day Day, who is Bob Grimes, and the house too. The spy house.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're one of many. I mean, we couldn't believe when Musha and I were doing this reconstruction or this walk, this commemorative walk. Many of these same safe houses were in the same place, and when we crossed through the Pyrenees, by the way, it's not like crossing that part of the Pyrenees, it's the low Pyrenees. It wasn't like we had to bring pickaxes and climb, but they're the steep hills and valleys. It was a nice hike, but many of the path is the same path. Anybody that thinks about Europe, Europe doesn't change sometimes. It stays the same, and we knew we were walking in the footsteps of those same people escaping 80 years earlier. So it was pretty remarkable.
That's incredible. Well, thank you for sharing this it's incredible. And so the other two books again were
The Pope's Last Crusade.
Pope's Last Crusade and MacArthur's Spies.
They're available to anybody that's interested in them, and I'd be delighted to hear about that.
So which book is read by you?
I read MacArthur's Spies. I had a special connection to that one because it focuses on the Philippines, and my dad was a Navy officer in World War II, and even has a bit part in the book. So I learned about things that actually led to making it possible for him to survive and the people around him survive. He participated in MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines in 1944 when MacArthur famously waited ashore and said, "I have returned." And my dad's ship was nearby serving. It was LST. It was serving as a hospital ship that day. So that was the one that I had to read myself, and it was great. I'm proud.
Super. That's great. That's awesome. Well, thank you. This has been incredibly enlightening, and I'm just so happy that we met and I was able to hear the story, and now I've got the book, and this is really, really cool. I'm really, really excited. So thank you, Peter. Really nice.
It's a pleasure, and I'm glad that we met also. And there was also the facility of being able to use your product. The teleprompter was just terrific for us in our presentation. So that was icing on the cake.
Awesome. Well, glad you liked it, and I'm glad I found a new friend. Thank you, Peter.
Same here.